Yeah, let's talk about the PAC4, which is all that is left, and what's transpired there as it relates to other schools. In the headlines of the PAC4, there had been conversation about Cal and Stanford, what's going to transpire. Atlantic Coast Conference held a day and a half worth of Zoom calls at the end of last week, and there were hours in which it looked like, bingo, they might be taking Cal and Stanford from the West Coast. Evidently, 7 schools spoke out against doing anything out on the West Coast. 4 of them voted when they had a straw poll, and they needed those 4, and so it's not going through. Those conversations have ceased. Meanwhile, speaking of the ACC, they got a fire in their backyard. Tomorrow is the deadline for Florida State to make a decision. Are you staying in this conference or are you going to leave? Seminoles over in Tallahassee have been barking for weeks. We don't like the media contract. It's substandard, et cetera. Because Florida State's not what it was in the Bobby Bowden era. But they have a Tuesday deadline. They have to inform whether they're going to leave, pay the exit fee, either go be an independent. The rumor on Tobacco Road right now is if Florida State exits, the Miami Hurricanes are going to exit. And they would join hands and they would go to the SEC in Birmingham and say, we're here. We'd like to be a member. Will you expand? Now, nobody knows whether the SEC is Greg Sankey, the commissioner, is ready to do that or not. So the ACC's got a problem in the backyard here. Nothing to do at all with Cal and Stanford. You know, what's going to happen with the PAC4? We talked extensively about ideas that were presented last week. Over the weekend, on Saturday, the PAC4 hired longtime college administrator, former NFL scout and executive to a degree, former star quarterback Oliver Luck.
Oh, yeah.
Oliver Luck has been hired as a consultant to help the PAC4 rebuild their brand. This guy's done a lot of unique and really different things in his career. I mean, he's street smart from an athletic standpoint. He's conversant because he worked in the NCAA league office, and he's just really a sharp business guy, being a former West Virginia quarterback. I don't know where that leaves the commissioner, George Kliavkoff, who saw this whole thing collapse under his reign. The only words I can use about George Kliavkoff, with them hiring Andrew Luck to come in the door and be the point man, George, good night now. I think there's a big issue there. And then this morning, the new president at Oregon State University wrote a letter to the other 3 presidents that are still there. And he urged and preached unity. 4 schools stay together. Oregon State, Washington State, we're banded together. Cal, Stanford, evidently, have linked at the arms. So we got 4, and the Oregon State president of the opinion, stay with us. We will work through the setbacks that we have had. So I put a lot of college football stuff at your front door, pick and choose.
Well, it's incredible how these conferences are all blowing up. I mean, this is going to get to a point where we have 2 conferences or just one big conference. I mean, it's amazing about Miami and Florida State maybe ejecting from the ACC. But I still have a hard time figuring Cal and Stanford would want to go to the ACC. I mean, because, you know, we talk about football, it might make sense, but for all those other sports, and Stanford has the most sports, I think, of any university in the nation, and they'd be sending them all the way back to, you know, Tobacco Road. I mean, that would just be silly. So, I mean, it just seems like they're not structuring all this logically. I mean, sure, they're chasing the money. I get that. They're entitled to do that, but it's creating this bizarre framework for the sport.
Yeah, I think the sport's out of control. You know, last week we had the story that this is one of the most detrimental things that has happened in college football. Well, I don't know if you rank it the worst, because the NIL and the transfer portal is pretty bleeping bad too. I just don't know how they're going to solve it. You know, if I'm in Colorado Springs on a Monday night, I'm just really worried that the PAC4 has come up with this money and go to San Diego State and go to Boise and go to Fresno and go to Colorado State and say, we will pay 50% of your exit fee to get out of the Mountain West right now. You know, because if somebody walks in the front door in Colorado Springs and says, here's the check for $34 million, I'm exiting at the end of this 24 season. They can't do anything about it. That's in the bylaws. But if I'm the Mountain West, now I'm freaked out Am I going to lose my top 4 schools? And what does my conference look like if the Aztecs and Boise and Fresno and CSU's Rams defect? All of a sudden, the Mountain West kind of resembles the. Do you remember the waning, dying days of the old Western Athletic Conference?
Oh, yeah. I remember those days.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty messy. So, yeah, you could, there's no doubt that the Mountain West would have $68 million new money found with the exit fees. But are you going to really improve your product if you go to Las Cruces and get into Mexico State? If you go across the border and get UTEP, what tradition is that? And, you can conduct a raid to go to the Big Sky and maybe get their 2 best schools, Montana State. But understand that the 1AA guys, or the FCS as they're now called, they don't grant 90 scholarships. 1AA scholarship totals 65. So can Montana State, which have really good programs and a nice heritage in the Big Sky, can they fund their school to 90 scholarships? And the other sidebar angle to this whole story is, what the hell do the New Mexico State Aggies, the UTEP Miners, Montana Grizzlies and Montana State Bobcats, what do they bring to the Mountain West? What's your conference going to look like? That's what all of a sudden looks back to me, and it's like the old whack. That's where we are.
It's incredible because the loyalty is out the window.
Yeah.
And
thank you, USC, UCLA. This is at your front door.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, you can roll the clock back earlier. I mean, Texas A&M bolted, right? And then the Nebraska and Missouri. But I just think of, it wasn't that long ago, like a week or 2 ago, that Utah and Arizona State, man, we're going to stay together. We're going to keep this thing together. And then they flipped like in a couple hours.
Well, when they saw the Apple TV proposal that Kleofkoff presented at the President's Council, and Oregon said, no, we're not signing that. We're not signing a $20 million a year deal, which is less than we're getting now. And we're not signing a deal that says, well, if our subscriptions go up, you'll get bumped up more. No, we're not doing that. Next thing you know, within an hour, Oregon was out, and a couple hours later, Washington was out. And by nightfall, the corner schools were out, and we're left with the Pac-4. So it's a really bad situation. Speaking